"You're an embarrassment," my mother said, loud enough for the catering staff to hear. "Your sister married a man who built something real. You chose a paramedic who smells like an ambulance." She looked me up and down the way you'd inspect a cracked piece of china before throwing it out. Then she reached across the reception table, picked up the place card with my name on it, and set it face down on the tablecloth. One slow, deliberate motion. The message needed no translation. I was standing in my sister's venue, a converted heritage building in downtown Ottawa with exposed brick walls and Edison bulb chandeliers that probably cost more per hour to rent than I made in a week. I was wearing the same navy blazer I'd worn to every family event for 3 years, because it was the nicest thing I owned that still fit. My husband Owen stood beside me in a button-down he'd ironed that morning at 5 a.m. Before his shift, still carrying the faint smell of antiseptic no amount of laundry detergent ever fully washes out of a paramedic's clothes. My sister Claudette had just married Aldous Renner, venture capitalist, 3 properties, the kind of man whose LinkedIn bio used the phrase serial entrepreneur without irony. The rehearsal dinner alone had cost more than Owen, and I paid in rent for an entire year. My mother smoothed the tablecloth where my place card had been and turned back to the floral centerpiece like I'd already left the room. I hadn't, not yet. 4 hours after that reception, a woman I had never met knocked on the door of our apartment in Gatineau. She was 60-something, silver-haired, wearing a wool coat with the federal government crest embroidered above the breast pocket. Behind her stood 2 men I can only describe as people who make other people nervous just by existing in a room. She looked at me, calm as still water, and said, "I've been looking for you for 18 months. But before I tell you what she meant, I need to tell you what happened at that reception table first. Because that night was the only night in my entire life when everything my family had built their opinion of me on got reduced to ash in front of the people they were most desperate to impress. And someone had to pay the price. Let me go back to that morning. I woke up at 6. Owen was already gone, his side of the bed cold, a travel mug of coffee sitting on my nightstand with a post-it note on it. The note said, "You've got this." 2 words and a hyphen because Owen communicates more in a scrawl than most people manage in a paragraph. The invitation to Claudette's wedding had arrived 6 weeks earlier in an envelope so thick and cream-colored it felt like holding a slice of wedding cake. Inside there was a handwritten note from my mother. I still remember the exact phrasing. She'd written, "Please dress appropriately this time. Aldis's family has standards." I'd set that note down on the kitchen counter next to a pile of Owen's continuing education binders and a stack of unpaid parking tickets, and I'd stood there for a long time without moving. Dress appropriately, this time. As if the crime I'd committed at Christmas 2 years ago, showing up in a fleece pullover because I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift, was something that needed to be referenced in writing. Owen found me still standing at the counter 20 minutes later when he got home from nights. He read the note over my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just put his arm around me, kissed the side of my head, and went to make eggs. That was Owen. He didn't perform empathy. He just quietly removed obstacles and fed people. I went to the wedding. Of course I did. Because that's what you do when you've spent your entire adult life trying to earn a seat at a table that keeps moving. My name is Siobhan Mackay. I'm a public health nurse. I've worked in community health for 11 years, mostly in low-income neighborhoods in Gatineau and Hull, doing prenatal visits, wound care, mental health check-ins for people who fall through every crack the system has. I drive a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked passenger side mirror. I pack my lunch in a reusable bag that has the Quebec Public Health logo on it and a broken zipper I keep meaning to fix. I have student loans I'll be paying off until my late 40s. My sister Claudette is a corporate communications director who got headhunted to Toronto at 26, moved into a Yorkville condo at 28, and married Aldous at 32 in a venue with a waiting list. She's beautiful in the specific way that makes photographers ask if they can use her photos without her permission. She also once told a reporter, in a profile piece in a Toronto lifestyle magazine, that she'd been essentially self-made, which was interesting because I had a very clear memory of lending her $4,000 when she was building her client list and hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. A loan she'd never mentioned again, not once. My mother orbited Claudette the way small moons orbit gas giants, always nearby, always reflecting her light. At the reception, my mother sat me at a table near the east exit, the one closest to the kitchen, where the servers walked back and forth all evening with trays. She'd seated Owen next to a second cousin he'd never met and across from Aldis's elderly aunt, who was hard of hearing and spoke only French. Owen's French extends to ordering at a Tim's and asking where the bathroom is. He spent the entire dinner leaning forward, nodding, and smiling with the patient focus of a man doing active listening in a language he doesn't speak. Every so often I'd catch his eye across the table, and he'd give me the smallest possible nod, the nod that meant, "I'm fine, stay where you are, I've handled worse." Owen has in fact handled worse. He's handled worse at 2 in the morning on the shoulder of the 417, with no backup and a patient who stopped breathing. He's handled worse on a ninth-floor balcony in Vanier, talking someone back from a ledge with nothing but his voice and the particular steadiness that comes from a person who was never trained to panic. He got his training at a community college in Pembroke. He makes $68,000 a year before overtime. He drives a truck that predates the current model by a decade. He is, by my family's accounting, unremarkable. By mine, he is the fixed point everything else orbits around. The comment that broke the surface came just before dessert. My mother was explaining to Aldous' mother, a woman named Faye, who wore pearls and maintained the careful neutrality of old money, that Claudette had always been the visionary in the family, the one who understood the world. Aldous' mother smiled and said, in that particular way that isn't actually a question, and your other daughter? My mother's eyes came to me. There was a pause. Not long. Half a breath. She's always been the caretaker type, my mother said. She married a paramedic. She pointed in Owen's direction with 2 fingers, the gesture you'd use to indicate a piece of furniture. He works for the city. Faye nodded slowly. My mother continued, some people are built for ambition, and some people are built for. She moved her hand in a small circle, searching for the word comfort. Siobhan has always chosen comfort. I set my fork down. The table was quiet enough that the silverware clicking against my plate was audible. Comfort. That was the word she'd chosen. Not service, not dedication, not 11 years of home visits to mothers with newborns and no support system, not the Tuesday afternoons I spent coordinating harm reduction supplies for a needle exchange program in Hull because the provincial funding had been cut and someone needed to fill the gap. Comfort. I looked at my mother across 3 meters of linen tablecloth and flower arrangements and the unspoken architecture of a lifetime of comparisons. And I thought about the day I was 17 and I came home from school with a letter from the University of Ottawa nursing program. Full entrance, a merit bursary. I'd put it on the kitchen table and gone to make a snack, and when I came back, my mother was on the phone with Claudette's pageant coach, and the letter had been moved to the recycling bin, not thrown away, just moved there, like a piece of junk mail that had been handled. I thought about my wedding 2 years later, small and impractical, held in Owen's aunt's backyard in Arnprior, with a rented tent and a playlist on someone's Bluetooth speaker. My mother had come, sat in the second row, and spent the reception talking to Owen's supervising officer about whether paramedics could be considered essential services or whether that was something that applied only to doctors. She asked this in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer. I thought about all of it while my mother explained to Faye that some people are built for comfort. And then I thought about 12 years ago, when none of these people knew my name. Because there's something my family never knew. Something I'd kept sealed for over a decade, the same way you keep a document in a fireproof box and don't take it out unless the building is actually burning. The building was burning. 12 years ago, I was 23. I'd just finished my first year of clinical placement at a hospital in Ottawa. I was also doing weekend volunteer shifts with a community outreach team that ran out of a church basement in Vanier, a neighborhood that doesn't show up in Ottawa tourism brochures, but houses a few thousand people who need medical attention and can't always access it. One Sunday in late November, we got a call from a building supervisor about a woman on the 3rd floor. No one had seen her in 4 days. The super had gone by, heard nothing, and didn't have authorization to enter. He'd called the city. The city had called us. I went with a more experienced nurse named Rosamund, a woman who'd been doing this work for 27 years, and had the specific, unhurried competence of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything. We knocked. No answer. The super let us in. The woman inside, I'll call her by her first name, which was Harriet, was in her late 60s. She'd had a stroke at some point in the previous 48 hours. She was conscious but not communicating. Her blood pressure when I took it manually with the kit I carried was high enough to make Rosamund reach for her phone. We stayed with her until the ambulance came. We stayed until the handover was complete. I held Harriet's hand the entire time because Rosamund was managing the clinical side, and someone needed to just be present for a person who was terrified and couldn't say so. Harriet recovered. I know because I followed up the way you do when you're 23, and you haven't yet built the emotional containment system that lets you separate the work from the person. She went to her daughter's house in Canada. She sent a card to the outreach organization. I was one of the people it was addressed to. I filed it away and kept going. What I didn't know at the time, what I wouldn't know for another 12 years, was who Harriet's daughter was. Back to the reception. I didn't cry at the table. I didn't slam my fist on the linen or make a speech. That's not who I am, and it's not what that room deserved. I breathed slowly, finished my water glass, and stood up. I excused myself, walked to where Owen was sitting, leaned down, and said quietly, I'm going to get some air. He looked up, read whatever was in my face, and nodded once. Then he stood up and put on his jacket without being asked. We walked out through the east exit. The kitchen door, the door I'd been seated next to all evening, and stood on a loading dock behind the venue in the November cold. Ottawa in November feels like the city itself has made a decision to be honest with you. No softness, no warmth. Just air that tells you exactly where you stand. Owen put his arm around me and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She genuinely believes that." I know. He was quiet again. Somewhere inside, someone was clinking a glass. A toast. I leaned my head on his shoulder and felt the specific weight of being known entirely by one person while being misunderstood by everyone else who shares your last name. We went home at 9. My mother texted me at 10:15, a message that consisted of 2 sentences. "You left early. Aldous' family noticed." I put my phone face down and went to sleep. The knock came at 7:30 the following morning. Owen had already left for a 7 o'clock shift. I was in my housecoat with a mug of tea, halfway through reviewing a client file for a home visit I had at 10. The woman in the wool coat introduced herself as a senior program officer with the Federal Ministry of Health. I didn't catch her name the first time because I was too focused on the 2 men standing behind her and on the laminated government ID she was holding up at eye level. She said, "May I come in?" I stepped back. She sat at my kitchen table, which still had Owen's travel mug on it and a grocery list I'd made on the back of a parking receipt. She folded her hands and looked at me with the particular expression of a bureaucrat who has rehearsed this conversation. She told me that 18 months earlier, a federal initiative had been launched to identify community health workers whose unreported interventions had been documented through hospital records, administrative files, and voluntary patient testimony. She told me the initiative was specifically designed to locate individuals whose contributions to public health outcomes had gone unrecognized by the formal system. She told me that one of the documented cases involved a woman named Harriet Bonsu, who had been found in her apartment in Vanier 12 years ago, whose stroke had been identified and responded to by a volunteer outreach team, and whose daughter had spent the past 18 months providing testimony to this initiative. She slid a business card across the table. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, "Thank you for holding my mother's hand. She told me about you." The name printed on the front of the business card was Dr. Miriam Bonsu, Chief Medical Officer of Health for the Province of Ontario. I looked at the card for a long time, long enough for the woman in the wool coat to say, gently, "She's been looking for you since her mother passed. Harriet passed 14 months ago. She mentioned you specifically before she went." I set the card down on the grocery list. I said, "I didn't do anything special. I just stayed." The woman in the wool coat looked at me across my cluttered kitchen table and said, "That's exactly what Dr. Bonsu said you'd say." 3 weeks later, the Ontario Ministry of Health announced the inaugural recipients of the Community Health Recognition Award, a distinction created specifically to acknowledge frontline and community health workers whose work had produced documented positive outcomes outside institutional settings. The announcement was made at a press event in Toronto. I was on the list. I found out from a colleague who texted me a link to the ministry press release at 7 in the morning while I was doing a prenatal home visit in Hull. I read it on my phone in my car in someone's driveway, my tea going cold in the cup holder, and I had to sit there for a few minutes before I could go back inside and keep working. I called Owen. He answered on the second ring, mid-shift. I heard the hum of the ambulance bay behind him. I said, "Something happened." He said, "Good something or bad something?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "I'm coming home after this call, don't process it alone." He was home by noon. The formal ceremony was held on a Thursday afternoon in February at a government building in Toronto, a large, warm room with provincial flags and a podium and about 200 people in chairs. Aldous happened to be in Toronto that week for a conference, which my mother somehow knew, and which is how my mother knew about the ceremony, which is how my sister Claudette found out, which is how both of them showed up in the back 2 rows without telling me. I didn't know they were there until I was already standing at the podium. Dr. Bonsu introduced me herself. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain, and she spoke about her mother the way people speak about someone whose voice they can still hear. She talked about the last conversation she'd had with Harriet, about the young nurse who had held her hand and talked to her softly while everything was uncertain. She said that her mother had described me as someone who made her feel like she mattered in a moment when no one was watching. She looked up from her notes. She looked at me. She said, "The work we see celebrated in this country tends to be the work that generates revenue or profile. I want to stand here today and say clearly that the work that holds our communities together is often invisible, often underpaid, and often done by people who do not ask to be recognized. We owe them a debt we can't quantify and have not tried hard enough to pay." 200 people applauded. I stood at the side of the room with my hands folded in front of me, in a blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion from a consignment shop in Gatineau, and I thought about a loading dock in November and the sound of a toast being made for someone else. Owen was in the 3rd row. He was the only person I could actually see clearly. He was leaning forward slightly with his elbows on his knees, the way he sits when he's paying full attention, and when my eyes found his, he gave me one slow nod. Same nod as always. The nod that meant everything. I accepted the award. I said what I'd prepared, that the work belonged to everyone who'd ever stayed when it would have been easier to leave, and that I was accepting it on behalf of the outreach team and Rosamund, who had driven through a snowstorm to get to that building 12 years ago and who still ran outreach on weekends out of her own vehicle at 71. After the ceremony, there was a reception, not a lavish one. Sandwiches and coffee on a long table, folding chairs, the hum of people networking and catching up. I was moving between conversations when I saw my mother and Claudette at the edge of the room. My mother's face when she saw me coming toward her was something I don't have a precise word for, not shame exactly. Something more like the expression of someone who has done a calculation and realized the numbers don't add up the way they thought. Claudette looked at the floor. My mother reached for my arm. Siobhan. She stopped, started again. I didn't know. You never told anyone. I looked at her calmly. I'm going to say that again to myself as I write this, because it took a long time to be able to do it. I looked at her calmly. I said, no, I didn't. She said, Dr. Osi Bonsu is the chief medical officer of the province. Do you understand how significant? I said. I've always understood. That part was never the issue. She blinked. The mascara she'd applied for the occasion was very slightly smudged at the outer corner of her left eye. She looked for a moment like a person instead of a position. She said, I want to make things right between us. I looked at her for a long time, long enough to let the words land and be examined. I said, I know you do. I said, but wanting to make things right and actually making them right are not the same conversation, and we haven't had the second one yet. She opened her mouth, closed it. Claudette, who had been silent this whole time, looked up. She said quietly, I still have the $4,000 I owe you. I was going to. I said, that's not what this is about. She nodded. There was a long pause. In the background, someone was refilling the coffee urn. A government official was laughing too loudly at something near the windows. My mother pressed her lips together. Her hands were clasped very tightly in front of her. She said, at the wedding I said something about comfort. I've been thinking about it since. I nodded. She said, I was wrong to say it. I said, yes, you were. Another pause. I said, I'm not going to pretend that what you said was small, and I'm not going to tell you it's already forgotten, because it isn't. But I'm also not going to let it be the last word between us, because you're my mother and I have 11 years of evidence that I'm better at sitting with difficult things than I am at walking away from them. She exhaled. Her shoulders dropped about 2 centimeters. I said, but I need you to understand something, and I need it to be understood clearly, not just apologized for and moved past. Owen is not a footnote. He is not a punchline or an example of comfort or a consolation prize. He is a person who has saved other people's lives, who held me together through 3 years of clinical work I was never trained to emotionally handle, who showed up to a federal ceremony in a shirt he pressed himself at 5 in the morning. And the next time you describe him to someone the way you described him to Faye Renner, I will not take a walk outside. I will leave entirely. And I won't come back. My mother looked at me. I held her gaze the way you hold a door open for someone. Firm, patient, not moving until they've passed through. She said, I understand. I said, good. I hugged her once, briefly, with one arm, the way you hug someone you're not ready to trust entirely but aren't ready to release either. Then I stepped back. I went to find Owen. He was standing near the sandwich table talking to Rosamund, who had taken the bus from Ottawa and arrived 40 minutes late and was now on her 3rd cup of coffee and showing Owen a photo on her phone of her new grandchild. He looked up when I approached, clocked whatever was on my face, and opened his arm for me to step into without stopping the conversation. That's it. That's the whole gesture. One arm, open. And I folded into the space beside him and listened to Rosamund talk about her granddaughter's name. And the coffee was bad, and the sandwiches were curling slightly at the edges, and I had a government plaque under my arm wrapped in tissue paper, and we had a 4-hour drive back to Gatineau ahead of us. And I was so tired I could have slept standing up, and I felt in that specific and irreducible way entirely fine. The months after that were not a movie montage. Nothing snapped into place overnight. My mother and I had 2 difficult phone calls that year, both of which ended with me needing to hang up and go outside for some air. Claudette transferred the $4,000 to my account with a text message that said only, this is long overdue. I'm sorry. I texted back, thank you. That was as far as either of us could get that day, and we both knew it. But something had shifted. Not fixed, shifted. The way a weight you've been carrying redistributes when someone finally acknowledges it's there. I went back to work the Monday after the ceremony. Home visit in Hull at 9, clinic admin in the afternoon, a phone consult with a client who needed help navigating a referral form that the provincial system had made needlessly complicated. Same job, same civic, same broken zipper on my lunch bag. Owen came home that evening smelling like a long shift. He sat at the table while I made dinner and told me about a call that had gone well, a kid who'd coded in the rig and come back, and the look on the paramedic student he'd been supervising when the kid opened his eyes. He told it the way he tells everything, factually, without drama, in the same tone you'd use to describe something you saw out the window on your commute. I thought about my mother's word, comfort. I thought about what it actually meant to build a life from that. To choose, every single day, the work that holds people together, rather than the work that attracts the most attention. To come home and tell the story plainly. To be the person in the room who stays when staying is the whole job. The plaque is on the bookshelf in our hallway. It's not centered, because the bracket on the back is slightly off, and neither of us has gotten around to rehanging it. It tilts about 3 degrees to the left. Owen calls it character. I asked him once, about a month after the ceremony, if it had bothered him, the way my family had spoken about him over the years. He thought about it for a long time, which is how I knew he was taking the question seriously. He said, "The people who needed me always knew what I was worth. That was always enough." He said it the same way he says everything. Quietly, without performance, in the register of a person who learned a long time ago that truth doesn't need an audience. I held on to that. The strongest thing I know is not the person who makes the most noise in the room, or earns the most money, or gets the best seat at the table. The strongest thing I know is the person who shows up anyway, does the work without applause, holds the hand that needs holding, and goes home at the end of the day without waiting to be thanked for it. I know that person. I married him. I try to be her. And if you've ever been told that what you do doesn't count because it doesn't have a price tag on it, I want you to know, I see you. The work is real. The value is real. The people you stayed for remember you long after the people who dismissed you have forgotten their own words.